All right. Well, let Jake now tell us about SVGs in Power BI. It's always a very interesting topic, especially for me. So without further ado, stage is yours, Jake.
So yeah, I'm going to be talking about how you can use Power BI and SVGs together. So SVGs are great. SVGs are great. You can expand upon what the native Power BI apps give you. So I blog on this sort of stuff on my blog. So valuation context.github.io, and there's my LinkedIn and into it. So first of all, what's the difference between just a regular image, like a raster image, and SVG? So raster images, each pixel in the image is going to have an RGB value, and it's just going to be a huge blob of data that you can't do much with. If you scale it up, scale it down, well, if you scale it up, it's going to get all pixelated because you haven't defined pixel size for that color that you defined that pixel. SVGs are quite different. So instead of being a kind of matrix of values, you're defining your image as code. And that means that you can scale it to whatever size you want. It's just there's going to be a render engine that's going to create it for you, right? And you can do animations, which is fun. So if we look at here, we can see that that the actual code is a bit like HTML, so that you'd have for a website. XML, sorry. So extensible markup language. So you define the SVG, then you have some items. So there's a whole bunch of elements that you can use to define an SVG. So you can have rectangles, circles, ellipses, lines, polygons, paths, and text. And you can define those in any order within your XML, and you can use that to create whatever images you really want. You can add some filters on top of that if you want to have certain effects, and you can add animations as well. There's a subset of Power BI visuals that actually support SVGs. So you've got tables, matrices, and some of the new stuff, so the cards, the button sliders. One thing to mention is really going to want to define those as measures, and you need to set your data category as image URL. Otherwise, all you're going to see is the text of the XML and not the actual image, which is great. First of all, how do you create a static SVG? So if you wanted to create this nice tick mark, we're going to define an SVG. Power BI likes to have this XML, this little URL here, otherwise it doesn't like to work. You define the width and height thing you want, and then you can, so this width and height corresponds to what you actually want the output of the size of the URL pixels to be. This view box piece corresponds to the actual piece within the code. So you can see I'm defining a circle, which has an X and a Y coordinate of 50-50. So that's kind of right in the middle of that 100, right? But then we're scaling that to a 20-20. So you have the idea of louder. Okay, so
That's why.
so you have the idea of you have the code space, but also the view space. So you can define both of them separately. And then, so the circle there, this item with a certain color, and then we have the path for the tick with another color, right? So nice and simple. But what we really wanted to do things like Sparklines and things that's going to be really based on our data. So the way that we do that is we need to define marks. What are marks? So marks are the data points in our data. So we're corresponding a row in our data to some sort of indicator on our graph. So that might be, if we're talking about a bar chart, that might be a rectangle. So we're going to have a rectangle on an axis. So the scale would be the axis. So you might have an x-axis and y-axis, that could be time, it might be value. And that rectangle is going to be in a certain place in time, but a certain height in value. And we have to think about being able to map also from our data scale. So we might have a value that was 10 million, But we don't want an SVG that's going to be 10 million. We need to scale that to maybe something that's going to be 10, 20 pixels high. So we have to do some mapping between the different scales. So I want to present a data model that I have here.
That may illustrate for a predicament where you could create the SVGs and then get the code from there, or is it sort of exclusively related to other platforms?
You can get the SVG from anywhere, but you will have to, if you want to make it dynamic, you're going to have a way of being able to feed data from your model into that SVG definition. Right, so pretty simple semantic model. This one's actually looking at the refreshes of Power BI reports. So we have workspaces, the semantic model, and the refresh on date. And then we have each refresh that semantic models had. And if we just start out this really boring report, we have our workspace. Within our workspace, we have different models. Within those models, we have different refreshes. So you can see this one's all succeeded. It took a certain amount of time. And we have a Sparkline to kind of show how long each of those refreshes took. But how could we make this more interesting? So if we talk, I started by talking about having a static visual to start with. So we can have a look at this. So this is a measure. Oh, let me try and zoom in a bit. So this is basically saying, I want to look at the most recent refresh. So if I've collapsed the matrix down, I'll look at the most recent refresh. If not, I just want to look at the current refresh. And I'm going to look at its status. So either it succeeded or failed. If it succeeded, on a nice tick box. And if it failed, on a cross, right? So as I said before, you need to set the image URL, the category to image URL, and we can drag that into our report. And there we go. We get nice ticks and crosses. And if you wanted to go really fancy, you could add some kind of animation, right? I'm not going to go into animations too much, but you can see there's an animate item here that just kind of flicks on and flicks off. But what we really want to do is something more like this Sparkline. So we want to be able to have something that's going to be able to show sort of time series or something within our report. So one of the first things I wanted to do with this was I wanted to look at how our refreshes have performed over time. So I wanted to look at over time, when did semantic models succeed? When did they fail? So how might we do that? Well, the first one we might want to do is represent each of those refreshes as a rectangle on a time scale. And then maybe we want to add a color to indicate their status, right? And then we might make the red a little bit bigger so you can see exactly if there's some overlap when those failures were. And then you can very easily, from a very top level, decide if you need to drill down and understand why your semantic models are failing. So this might end up looking quite large, but it is relatively simple, right? We're taking an amount of data and we're saying I want to, and where's the add columns? I'm easily looking at it. Oh yeah, concatenate X. So we're using concatenate X as an iterator, and we're going to pick a granularity that we care about. In this case, it's going to be datetime. We're going to iterate each of those, and we're going to decide to create an element. So we're creating a rectangle at a certain point with certain properties. That's going to be the color, it's going to be the size, and then that's going to create this big XML that's going to create our image. So that's quite a simple one. But then you can do things like create a heat map. So something like this. So if you're thinking about the refresh time, you might want to see if some models kind of cluster in some amount of refresh time and some cluster in another, to see whether or not you might need to dive down and see if you might want to maybe move your semantic model refresh for another time because there's some overlapping with other reporting. So how do you think about creating an SVG like this? So instead of a time scale, this time we're going to have the value scale of the refresh time. And we're going to plot out each semantic model's refresh time on that scale. We're then going to take samples at evenly spaced boxes across that scale. You just count the number of refreshes within each box and just color them. And so the color is using one of those filters. So it uses a linear gradient. So we're just defining, we can figure out what our minimum value is, what our maximum value is a box. And we can say, well, I'm going to convert that to 0, 255. So that's the max hex value. And we're defining the color in hex. Now I can just map that. So then we have a nice grayscale. We can map that grayscale to a color scale. In this case, it's just going to be some green, right? And we can have a look at that. So it just looks like that. And my last example is going to be building upon that. It's going to be a violin plot. So the violin plot is actually simple. It's very similar to the last one, even though it looks more complicated. A violin plot's probably better than the heat plots because I think they're more well understood by people. I think they're easier to interpret. And so the way that you build, the way that a violin plot works is you use something called kernel density estimation. So again, we have a value scale and we have our data points. But instead of considering our data points as points, we consider them as clouds. So a kernel. In this case, we just consider each of them just to have a normal distribution for standard height. And then we can have them together. So we have constructive interference. We can draw our boxes again. And then we just sample across our boxes and figure out what the value is going to be. And then we can just draw lines, right? And that's going to be our violin plot. But it wouldn't look very good if we had just straight lines, right? What we really want is nice curvy lines. So instead of using the line item for SVGs, we use something called the path item. And path items allow you to draw Bezier curves. And they sound very fancy, but all it really means is you're drawing a line, but in the middle of the line, you're drawing a control point which just says, pull the center of the line just a little bit this way. And that creates a nice curve, and you can specify the kind of gradient bit. So all we really need to do is apply an extra X or Y value right in the center. So back to where we were again. We add our control points, and we get a nice curvy line. Now, I had a sparkline on my original presentation, on my report, right? And they're surprisingly similar to SVGs. So if we actually, so if we go to my, I go to here, and let's just throw away all these SVGs because they're noise, and just keep the sparkline. If we were to just look at Performance Analyzer and refresh the visual, and we have a look at the code, if you look at the definition of the sparkline, it's surprisingly similar to what you would have if you were just drawing rectangles or lines or whatever for an SVG. So we have this P, which is a path, and then we give X, Y coordinates. So it's just this whole array of X, Y coordinates. Why is this interesting? If you want to create an SVG, there's a lot you can learn from the structure of this DAX code. So the way the SVG works, the sparkline works, is it creates this ad hoc measure in your query. So you've not defined this query. Power BI creates it for you when it creates this table. And if you're trying to create quite performant SVGs, because with SVGs, if you're trying to do a lot of SVGs on a large set of data, there are performance implications because you're creating pretty large strings. If you follow this pattern, there's a good SQL BI article on this. You can improve your performance quite significantly. So that's something to look at. It's not the most readable thing in the world, but in a lot of cases, you can just take the first half of this, and where it starts to do this P, just add your own stuff. So instead of doing, you've got this min value range X, this could all just be path, rectangle, whatever you like, right? So there's some other best practices that I've found from pain. So I had a model that was deployed for a while. And it was fine up to a point, and then one day I logged in and I got this error. So I ran out of memory. Power BI only allows you to have 32,000 characters in your measure, which sounds like a lot, but it's not a lot, really. So anything you can do to reduce the size of the strings in your SVG is going to be great. So you're going to avoid having this error. You can show more data points, and you're going to have a smaller cache, right? Data cache. So first thing you might think of is reducing the amount of data, so the number of data points. So you might use sample to just take random points that you want to draw points for. You might use top end just to pick it out. Or you might decide to use a different grain of data. So rather than using day, you might use month, you might use year, right? But you could also use some other techniques to try and reduce the size of the strings. So if we look at this first one, this was what I was using before. I was drawing just regular lines. So each line ended up being, on average, about 78 characters. If we use path instead, which is very similar, but we're slightly more condensed, we get a 20% savings, which is great. But there's this really nice concept of using defs. In this case, we're defining an item. So we have this L1 item. It has the properties that we want to use for that. So it's got a color, it's got a width, it's got a position. And then we can just go and use it with this really short string, and we can overwrite any properties that we want to. So in this case, I want to draw this thing at an x coordinate of 1. And that gives us massive savings, over double the amount of points. So it's great. And if you were really interested in getting some inspiration for any of these things, I would recommend looking at Kerry Kloster's blog and Kurt Buehler as well. He's got some stuff on GitHub for inspiration. So if we were to go and have a look at those, I tried not to do too many of the very well-known visuals. That's what I want to do. So if you want to look at the documentation for how SVGs all work, here's all the different items and all the things you might care about. Or standard stuff. So you can have a look at a whole bunch of these, right? So gauges, sparklines, areas, barcodes, just scatters, all this sort of thing. There's a huge amount of resources online that you can kind of pull and get some inspiration from. One thing to mention is, although it might be a bit daunting at the moment for creating SVGs, because you have to go in, modify the measure to fit your data, there is a new feature that's been announced by Power BI, user-defined functions, which are going to be very useful in this area. So the way that user-defined functions work is there's a new part of the model, which is defined for functions. And you can create your own custom function, the same way that you use SumX or calculate or anything. You could have SVG line chart, and you could specify I want to use axis 1, axis Y, whatever else, and just have a very small function. And I think you'll see in the future, instead of coming to a blog and having to copy this and try and make it work for you, you'll be able to copy and paste a function and just apply a couple of variables, and it's going to work perfectly for you in the future. That's AI. So if you have any trouble with this, AI is pretty good with SVGs. It might not perfectly talk between DAX or your data model and SVG, but it'll probably get you most of the way, right? And if you have the inspiration, have an idea of what you want to do, you can get pretty far with that, and then kind of middle around and try and figure out exactly what you want. But yeah.
I was wondering, like, how successful you have been with, like, creating something like really, with, you know, with AI specifically, like SVGs, because, you know, like I'm used to the in natural language, like, yeah, but it's usually really good.
Yeah.
Obviously, I've not really played around with SVGs, so I was wondering, from your experience, you create something wow with just AI kind of basic stuff.
The only thing I've done with AI and SVGs is the nice flashing thing here, and that's pretty wow, right? So yeah, no, I've not tried it too much. A lot of the stuff I presented, like the violin plots and everything, it's kind of pre-AI, or at least for me, at least, yeah. So you can get pretty far on your own steam. I mean, it's not too complicated. You just have to get an idea of how to map. Think about grammar graphics. So if you think of like the R world or Deneb, if you kind of think about that sort of world, this is very similar. So you're thinking about scales, you're thinking about different types of marks, and how you are mapping between everything, your data and that visual aspect.
I mean, the flashing is brilliant.
Obviously.
But I'm just wondering, so I'm quite lazy, and also I don't make pretty reports. It's not really what I do. So, but is the main reason why you go down this path is to make it your own, make it look exactly how you want it,
So
Have that kind of like stuff.
I think it's to overcome. I think it's to overcome limitations. So, I mean, there's an external tool for Violin plots. Your company might say, "Can't use them." This is all native built into Power BI. And also with Violin plots as the visual, you can only have so many. Whereas you could have hundreds and do exactly what you want. So there are benefits. It might take a little bit of extra work, but it might fill a gap with the product, which is why I think they actually exist in the first place, to kind of smooth over the cracks in the actual Power BI. That's not happening.
Using SVGs is one on its own.
Lots of SVGs,
Lots of SVGs.
lots of button slicers
Yeah.
and SVGs.
So like.
And that, because that made it so individual, but it also made it to make it exactly how you.
Yeah, you can translate your vision to whatever you want. Yeah.
So like browse.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So Ingy Park, Microsoft MVP,
Yeah.
he has some C# scripts that will create, I forget the standard. There's some like data formatting standard that's used by banks, right? Or something.
IBM something.
Yeah, something like that. So he has C# script where you can just feed, where it pops up in the tab of the editor, pops up a bunch of screens, it asks you for X, Y coordinates and like a value, and create this SVG, which is going to be compliant with that standard. So there's a whole bunch of things you can do.
Coming back to Dan's point there, I use SVG quite a lot, so actually some of the techniques you mentioned, and it's definitely possible. But I think you also have to be quite careful to not create a monster, because you can't just AI and go crazy and you notice you have 500 lines now. So yeah, also to be mindful of maintenance and how are you going to hand that over to someone else if they don't know SVG. Something breaks, they just scratch your hands and it's gone. So yeah, it's quite flexible, but I think you have to find the right balance there between doing what you want, but also make it maintainable going forwards. So I think there's a balance there for sure.
Yeah.
What's the impact of that?
Memory errors. So if you do too much, you can get memory errors, right? So these are quite big. How big is a piece of string? It depends on how big. So it depends on how big the table is that you're trying to display in. So the granularity of the data that you're actually going to display, and how big the SVG is for each of them, because it's going to have to calculate it for each row in that table. Well, 500 rows, because it takes top end, right, in the visuals. So it's really good if you want to do sparklines and stuff in cards. So if I add something to this card, so if I have a boring card, normally you couldn't add a visual up here, but if I go and go to images and say I want to put in put the heat map in, right? So if you wanted to sparkline or just anything up in your cards, great. That's going to use barely any sort of resources. It's calculated once. It's not going to have any impact. If you do big things on tables and matrices, you might run into problems. Then you're going to want to think about that data minimization and think about really what sort of granularity you want to be calculating those things at. If you're just doing cards, that's going to enhance things loads, and it's not going to affect anything at all.
Have a broken Power BI report using SVGs that made it into data apart. Broken the PBR report and you turned it into something that looks artistic.
Yeah. It's not that hard to make a Power BI. People get data errors all the time, like out of memories.
So and then it creates a completely different.
Yeah, I mean, it's different in the fact that I had to search for data minimization options. Because I really wanted to see everything. So I want to, because all this was in aid of I'm a Fabric admin. So I want to look at my tenants and see what's going wrong, what's going right, just from a view. And SVGs give you that. But just looking at just a whole bunch of all of text and numbers, you've got no insight on what's going on. If I have this barcode visual, it's great. So if I have a whole bunch of reds on my right-hand side for a particular workspace, I know, well, something's going pretty wrong in that workspace. I should probably go look at it and go fix something, or like tell someone to fix it, right? But if you're just looking at if you're looking at this any other way, you'd have to open up the workspace and try and figure out a trend. You can really easily see a trend. So it all comes down to your needs and what you're trying to do. In this case, it works great for me, but something else might work for you. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. I think you can do it with, I forget the name of it. So James Dale, Fabric, London, Icon Map Pro. I think that supports SVGs because he had at his Power Hours session, he had an interactive map with SVG images of all the Microsoft product team.
I've seen that.
Yes, so I would look that way direction. Yeah. Ooh.
Plans, like, it's really, it's not a massive public out there, it's not some sort of get a chance to see it.
Yeah. More? No.
Anyone though?
Yeah, if you just want to do really simple stuff, these can be incredibly impactful. If you just want to start here and dip your toes in, like that adds a lot. Because rather than reading success failed, you can just instantly get an idea, even just from the color of what's going on. And you don't have to do conditional formatting because it's kind of limited. If you want to, so you could just go to a website and you can say, show me a picture of give me the SVG code for a tick. And then all you have to do is create a measure that just says, I'm going to do a switch statement. If the value succeeded, show me this tick. If it's failed, show me that cross. So, I mean, you just copy and paste in. Like you could define that as just a measure. It's called tick. And then you call that one as a measure called failure. You just say, if succeeded, tick. Yeah.
So the only thing I guess that we have to do is row 15, isn't it? So the website might not be.
Yeah, you have to add this nonsense, this data image, SVG. That just has to be there, otherwise it doesn't like you.
So that's the only thing that's going to be different from what you just copy paste. I copy paste.
Yeah, just find somewhere that's happy for you to use their content. So if there's no copyright laws, yeah, just copy and paste and use it. Otherwise, pay them some money.
Last question? Anyone?